you've deprived someone of you, of the relationship that you have with you. For me, the deprivation that I encountered at the beginning of my academic career with my friend killing himself was far less impactful on my life personally than the deprivation that I experienced from my graduate school mentor killing himself. Because I'm almost completing my PhD. I think I was already ABD. I'm doing my field research. For my own personal development, I decided to go more into traditional African sort of, I don't want to use the word mysticism because it's always sort of derogatory, but traditional African religious practices. And I wanted to study with people who understood it. And not just African, also Jamaican. And he happened to be Jamaican. And Jamaican religious practice, sort of black magic practice, there's a practice called Obia. So I was studying under someone who knew this rather well. And then he killed himself. Where am I going to get this information from, right? So it left me in a very precarious situation, because here I am, a student, hungry for knowledge, seeking an individual who has that knowledge. I formally declared a double graduate major in Africana Studies. I started teaching for the Department of Africana Studies. I started being mentored by this individual, and I'm learning about traditional African, and obviously the Jamaican practice of Obia comes from Africa in some regards, and I'm studying and I'm learning about stuff that doesn't necessarily apply to my PhD degree, but applies to me personally, things that I'm interested in personally. And here this guy kills himself. He deprived me of his expertise, right? There's a sense in which he had an obligation. Yes, I recognize, and this is not to demonize, but I really want to give a good lecture. I want the lecture to be, as all my lectures, I want it to be, there has to be some sense of, this is just how I teach. There's a personal bit of me in all of these lectures, not because I want to share my personal information with freaking the entire globe, but that I think insofar as I divulge some of this, you can understand the concepts better, right? I recognize that my instructor has a right to suicide, but I also recognize that insofar as he accepted me as a student, and we had been in a mentor-student relationship for about a year, that he also accepted an obligation to me. Right? He obligated himself to me because I was there under his tutelage to learn. And I'm one of those type of students. I'm one of those type of students that once I find a mentor, I devote myself to this individual or this institution. Right? I become a complete sponge. And to kill himself deprived me of what he had, and I thought he had an obligation to me. What we recognize then is that the second aspect of the stigma isn't just deprivation, but it becomes more personal. Right? Deprivation is more of an abstract notion. The real stigma behind suicide is one of selfishness. And this is a much harder piece, right? It's a much harder piece to acknowledge, because you think to yourself, I'm not saying that this is correct or not. I'm not here to make value judgments on this, right? This is, again, noting the disclaimer at the beginning of the lecture series. In terms of a medical ethics, right? In terms of the way in which we potentially institutionalize the practice of suicide, one of the big problems with institutionalized euthanasia in the United States, though it's legal in other aspects, and I think it's legal in Oregon, I'm not positive, but one of the huge problems in institutionalized suicide, euthanasia, is the idea of selfishness, right? Though the individual may want and may have the right to take his or her own life, in terms of symbolic interactionism, and I've done a video series of symbolic interactionism, right? In terms of symbolic interactionism, we immediately recognize that individuals, not all, but most of us, the overwhelming majority of us, are connected to other people. Right? So that there is, and I don't mean socially, right? We are connected to varying degrees to other people, right? I have my colleagues and work friends. I have my virtual friends. I have my immediate family. I have my extended family. I have my network of, organizations that I belong to, and so on. Insofar as I have a right to suicide, and I could argue that others have the obligation to respect that right, once I kill myself, once I decide to kill myself, that nexus of connection, which is bound in my physical body, I am the link between all of these disparate groups, is gone. And the idea is that that's a very selfish act, right? The stigma behind suicide is that it is selfish because you weren't thinking about me, right? You weren't thinking about the loved one who didn't want you to die. You weren't thinking about the student who needed you to be here, and it wasn't out of anything other than sort of, from my account, didn't you recognize, if I were to speak to this person again, didn't you recognize that, this was going to leave me in limbo? And I never did complete the degree. I could have done the degree in my sleep, but I never did complete the degree because after it happened, it threw me off because I thought I escaped that, right? It happened earlier in my life. It happened with less close, less intimate relationships. And then here it is, I'm at the end of my academic sort of matriculation. I'm buzzing intellectually. I've sort of found my stride. I can conceptualize the notion at that point of suicide, not to the level that I can now, but at that point, I could conceptualize the notion of suicide in a pretty abstract, pretty complex way, and my mentor kills himself. Now I'm just like, forget it. It wasn't meant to be. So I walked away from it. Part of the reason why I walked away from sort of my second graduate degree was because I felt both deprived of his expertise, but I also had a bit of resentment because of what I perceived to be selfish. Now, I'm not going to go into the psychological bits on whether that's accurate or how to deal with this because I'm not trained with those tools. I don't have those tools in my toolkit. What I'm saying is, in terms of the stigma, can we do away with that stigma? And one attempt, just one attempt, to say that, yes, we potentially could do away with the stigma attached to suicide is to recognize that the individual's relationship to me, right, though it was inherently destroyed, as a matter of fact, the relationship was destroyed, we should look at it as rather, or we could look at it as rather, not one of selfishness, how could you leave me, but the idea that whatever the turmoil was, physical or psychological pain, the presence of that angst, the presence of that turmoil, the presence of that, just the desire or the obsession with sort of suicide for the individual could have destroyed the relationship that he or she had with me anyway, right? So, I mean, again, I'm not a psychologist, I can't get into this bit because I'm not formally trained, but the idea is, can we think about the stigmas attached to suicide? Yes, I can do that rather easily, deprivation and selfishness. Can we, the term is called reframing in conflict resolution, can we reframe the notion of deprivation and selfishness in more positive terms? I think in terms of conflict resolution, this is where therapy and conflict resolution, there could potentially be overlap, and I don't cross that threshold at all. I would leave that potential reframing to psychiatrists and psychologists because they're trained in this. Obviously, the article is written by a psychiatrist. But the idea is, yeah, the stigma's there. The stigma is, in a sense, legitimate. But is there a possibility for that stigma to be reframed in more charitable terms to the individual who's committed the act? And I say yes. How that's done is not something that I'm academically equipped to discuss